Jake had always enjoyed the quiet of his rural home. Nestled on several acres of land, his property was his sanctuary, a place far removed from the chaos of city life. He had inherited it from his father, along with an old but sturdy shed at the back of the property. The shed wasn't much to look at, but it served its purpose as storage, mostly forgotten except for the occasional use. That piece shattered one night when Jake was jolted awake by the unmistakable thump of bass-heavy music. At first, he thought he was imagining it, but as he sat up in bed, he heard voices, loud, drunken laughter, the clinking of bottles, and even the unmistakable pop of fireworks. Frowning, he got up, grabbed a flashlight, and peered out his window. What he saw made his blood boil. His backyard had been overrun. Cars were parked carelessly on his grass, their headlights flashing as people stumbled around in party outfits. His shed, his private shed, had been turned into some kind of makeshift nightclub. Inside, flashing lights illuminated figures, dancing, drinking, and shouting over the music. And at the center of it all, standing like she owned the place, was Karen. Jake's jaw clenched. Of course, it was her, his insufferable, boundary-pushing neighbor who always acted like everything around her was hers for the taking. Taking a deep breath, Jake stepped into his boots and made his way toward the chaos. It was time to put an end to this. The confrontation. Facing Karen, Jake's boots crunched against the dry grass as he stormed toward the shed, his flashlight beam cutting through the night. His heart pounded with rage, but he kept his steps steady, his hands clenched at his sides. He had dealt with Karen's nonsense before, but this was a new level of audacity. As he approached, the music blasted louder, drowning out the natural sounds of the night. Inside the shed, figures swayed and stumbled, raising their bottles in drunken toasts. Someone had strung up cheap LED lights, casting a dizzying glow across the wooden walls. Jake shoved the door open with a bang. The hinges groaned, and for a brief moment, the party froze. A dozen glassy-eyed faces turned toward him, blinking in confusion. But then, "Whoa, party's still going," a man hollered, pumping his fist in the air. The music blasted again, and the revelers cheered, oblivious to the fury burning in Jake's eyes. And there she was, Karen. She stood near the center of the shed, clad in a glittering silver dress that was far too glamorous for a party held in someone else's storage space. A martini glass dangled from her manicured fingers, and she turned to Jake with an exaggerated, patronizing smile. "Oh, Jake," she cooed, striding toward him as if they were dear old friends. "You finally decided to join us. I was wondering when you'd come out of that old house of yours." Jake's patience snapped like a dry twig. "What the hell is going on, Karen?" His voice cut through the music like a whip. "Why are you in my shed? Who gave you permission to throw a party on my property?" Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes as she took a delicate sip of her drink. "Oh, don't be such a grump," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "This place was just begging for a party. I mean, honestly, Jake, you're sitting on all this land, and you never use it. It's practically wasted." Jake's jaw clenched. "It's my land, Karen, not yours, and definitely not for a bunch of drunk strangers to trample all over." Karen laughed, actually laughed, like he was the one being ridiculous. "Oh, lighten up. It's just a little fun. No harm done. The neighborhood needed a good night out, and I took the initiative to make it happen." She gestured grandly at the chaos around her, as if expecting applause for her community service. Jake scanned the scene. Empty beer bottles littered the floor. Someone had dragged in an old couch, its once clean fabric now stained with who knows what. A group of rowdy guys were playing some kind of drinking game near his tool bench, pounding on the wood like it was their personal bar counter. "No harm done," Jake echoed, his voice low and dangerous. He pointed toward a drunken couple who were attempting, badly, to climb onto his old tractor. Get them down from there before they break something. Karen barely spared them a glance. Oh, relax, they're just having fun. Jake's fists clenched. Karen, this is trespassing. I didn't give you permission to be here. You need to shut this down, now. At that, Karen's smile faltered for the first time. A flicker of irritation crossed her face before she smoothed it away. Jake, be reasonable. The party's already in full swing. What do you expect me to do? Just kick everyone out? Yes, Jake snapped. That's exactly what I expect. Karen huffed dramatically, placing a hand on her hip. Ugh, you're being so difficult. It's just one night. Why are you so possessive about this old shed? Jake took a slow, deep breath, his patience hanging by a thread. Karen, if you don't shut this down right now, I will call the cops. That got her attention. Her eyes widened, and she let out a nervous laugh. Oh, come on, Jake. You wouldn't do that. That's so unnecessary. Besides, everyone's already here. What's the harm in letting it go on for a few more hours? Jake took a step closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. I'm giving you 5 minutes. Either you start telling your guests to leave, or I'll let the sheriff do it for you. And trust me, Karen, you really don't want that to happen. Karen's lips pursed. She glanced around, as if looking for support from the crowd, but most of them were too drunk to care. Finally, she let out an exaggerated sigh. Fine, she muttered, tossing back the rest of her drink. But you're being such a buzzkill. Jake didn't respond. He only stood there, arms crossed, watching as Karen begrudgingly began clapping her hands and calling for attention. All right, everyone. Looks like Mr. Serious over here wants his precious shed back. Party's over. The crowd groaned in protest, but Jake didn't care. One by one, people began to shuffle out, some complaining, others laughing drunkenly. Karen shot him one last glare before flipping her hair and strutting toward her car. Jake watched as the trespassers finally cleared out, his rage simmering beneath the surface. He knew Karen wouldn't let this go, and something told him this wasn't the last time she'd push her luck. Jake stood at the entrance of his shed, his arms crossed, glaring at the drunken partygoers who still milled about like they had every right to be there. The bass of the music thumped against his ribs, the stale scent of spilled alcohol mixed with the musty scent of his old tools, and at the center of it all, standing with her usual infuriating confidence, was Karen. She sipped from her half-empty martini glass, unbothered, like a queen surveying her kingdom. Jake's patience had already worn thin, and yet Karen's smug expression somehow managed to push him further. Karen, he said, his voice cold. I don't know what made you think this was okay, but it isn't. This is trespassing. You and every single one of these people are on my land without permission. Karen gasped, clutching her chest dramatically. Trespassing? Oh, Jake, don't be ridiculous. I honestly thought you wouldn't mind. I mean, look at this shed. She gestured around as if she were revealing some grand discovery. It was just sitting here, all dusty and forgotten. It's practically abandoned. Jake clenched his fists. It's not abandoned. It's my property. Karen sighed, shaking her head like a mother disappointed in her child's lack of gratitude. Jake, be reasonable. I was doing you a favor by making use of this place. It's just been wasting away out here. If anything, this shed has probably never had this much life in it before. Jake stared at her, speechless for a moment. A favor? Was she seriously trying to spin breaking into his shed into some kind of good deed? Karen, he said, voice tight with barely controlled anger. You broke into my property, threw a massive party without asking me, and now you're trying to tell me you were doing me a favor. Karen rolled her eyes. Oh, stop making it sound so dramatic. I didn't break in, Jake. The door wasn't even locked. Jake let out a humorless laugh. Oh, so because I didn't lock the door, that means you have free rein to use my property. However you want? She shrugged, sipping her drink again. I mean, yeah? You clearly weren't using it, so why let it go to waste? Besides, she added with a smug grin, I did announce the party in the neighborhood Facebook group. If you had a problem with it, you should have said something then. Jake's eye twitched. What Facebook group? Karen gasped again, eyes wide with faux surprise. Oh, come on, Jake. The Facebook group. The one where all the cool neighbors stay updated. Maybe if you actually engaged with the community a little more, you'd have seen my post. Jake's teeth clenched so hard his jaw ached. So, let me get this straight, he said slowly, trying to keep his voice steady. You posted in some random Facebook group without ever actually talking to me, and just assumed that meant you could use my shed? Karen huffed, clearly annoyed that he wasn't seeing things her way. Well, yeah, I figured you wouldn't mind. Everyone loved the idea, Jake. The comments were so positive. She flipped her hair over her shoulder, her arrogance unwavering. Honestly, you should feel honored. This is probably the most fun thing that's ever happened on your boring old property. Jake exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. Karen, this isn't a public park. This is my land. You don't get to just decide to use it because you think I won't mind. Karen sighed dramatically. All right, fine, she said, rolling her eyes. You're obviously upset, but let's not overreact here, okay? It's just a little party. We'll be out of here by morning. No harm, no foul. Jake's fingers flexed at his sides. No harm. He pointed toward the littered beer bottles, the spilled drinks, and the cigarette butts scattered across the floor. You trashed my shed, Karen. Then he jabbed a finger toward the half-drunk guy currently passed out on his tractor. And that idiot nearly busted my equipment. Karen waved him off. Oh, please. A little mess never hurt anyone. I'll have some of the guys clean it up before we leave. No big deal. Jake narrowed his eyes. And what if I don't want to wait until morning? What if I want everyone gone, now? Karen pouted. Jake, come on. You're acting like this is some kind of crime. It is, he snapped. You broke in and threw a party on private property. That is literally illegal. Karen groaned, rubbing her temples like he was the one giving her a headache. Ugh, you're making this so much more complicated than it needs to be. She turned toward the partygoers, who were now starting to take notice of the argument. Everyone, can we all agree that Jake is seriously overreacting right now? A few drunken cheers rang out. Jake gritted his teeth. Karen, I'm not playing around. Get everyone out now, or I'll call the cops. Karen's smile twitched, but she quickly replaced it with a scoff. Oh, please. The cops won't care about a harmless little party. Jake pulled out his phone and held it up. Want to bet? Karen's eyes flickered with the briefest hint of worry. Oh, stop, she said quickly. There's no need for that. Look, I promise we'll be out of here soon. No need to waste police resources over something so silly. Jake didn't lower his phone. 3 minutes, Karen. If people aren't leaving by then, I'm calling. Karen's fake smile finally cracked, irritation seeping through. She looked around at the party, realizing that Jake wasn't bluffing. With a dramatic sigh, she clapped her hands and called out, All right, everyone. Apparently Mr. No Fun wants us gone. She threw a glare at Jake before continuing. Start packing up, I guess. There were a few complaints, but most people were too drunk or tired to argue. Slowly the party began to break up. Karen turned back to Jake, pouting like a scolded child. You know, you really need to learn to relax. Jake didn't respond. He only stood there, watching as the last of the uninvited guests stumbled toward their cars. As Karen sauntered past him, she smirked. You'll regret being such a buzzkill, Jake. Mark my words. Jake met her gaze, unflinching. "No, Karen. The only thing I regret is not calling the cops sooner." Karen scoffed and flipped her hair before strutting off into the night. Jake exhaled, surveying the mess they had left behind. Something told him this wasn't the last time he'd have to deal with Karen. Jake took a slow breath, his anger momentarily giving way to something else, an almost wicked amusement. As Karen continued prattling on about how he was being overly dramatic about the whole situation, he glanced toward the far side of the shed, where a row of wooden crates sat in the shadows. Most of the people in the shed had no idea. They were too drunk, too distracted by their own noise, but Jake knew. Nestled inside those crates, perfectly safe and secure, for now, were several of his late father's prized pythons and boas. They were harmless, but they didn't look harmless. Jake's lips twitched as an idea took root. If Karen wanted to act like she owned the place, maybe it was time she got properly acquainted with its true residents. Karen was still talking, waving her martini glass around as if she were giving some grand speech. "I still don't understand why you're making such a big deal out of this, Jake," she huffed. "Honestly, you should be thanking me. If anything, this party has probably made your sad little shed feel useful for the first time in years." Jake smirked. "You know, Karen," he said, stepping toward the back of the shed. "You might be right. This shed does serve a purpose." Karen blinked, caught off guard by his sudden change in tone. "See? Now you're finally making sense," she said, flashing a smug grin. Jake crouched near one of the crates, making a show of unlatching it. "Yeah, my dad spent years putting this place together, kept his most prized possessions in here." Karen tilted her head. "Prized possessions? What, like old tools?" She snorted. "Please, this place is a junkyard." Jake ran his hand along the wooden lid of the largest crate. Not quite. With a sharp movement, he flipped the latch open and lifted the lid. There was silence for a split second. Then, a slow, thick, glistening coil of scales slid over the edge of the crate. Karen's smug expression froze in place. The music still blared from someone's Bluetooth speaker, but it was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Then the first scream tore through the shed. "Oh my God! What the hell is that?" A woman dropped her drink, splashing sticky beer across the floor as she scrambled backward. Jake remained perfectly still, watching as one of his father's beloved pythons, a stunning 6-foot-long albino beauty, slowly uncoiled itself, blinking lazily at the chaos around it. Someone knocked over a folding chair. Another guy tripped over his own feet in his rush to back away. Karen had gone completely rigid, her eyes locked onto the snake like it had personally insulted her. Jake," she stammered, her bravado melting away. What the hell is that?" Jake crossed his arms. "That?" He gestured toward the snake, which had begun to explore its surroundings with flicks of its tongue. "That's Jasper, one of my dad's pythons." Karen let out a strangled laugh. You have snakes in here?" Jake feigned innocence. "Well, yeah, didn't I mention that?" Karen's face drained of color. "No, you did not." Jake shrugged. "Huh, must have slipped my mind." And then he lifted the lid on the second crate. A chorus of shrieks rang out as a second snake, a thick, dark boa, began to slither free. That was the final straw. The entire party exploded into pure panic. Someone knocked over the Bluetooth speaker, cutting the music short. A guy in a Hawaiian shirt practically threw himself toward the door, scrambling over fallen beer cans. A girl shrieked as she climbed onto a table, as if that would protect her from the deadly creatures slithering nearby. Karen, for all her arrogance, had gone completely stiff, her eyes darting wildly between the snakes and the open doorway. Jake leaned against the crate, enjoying the spectacle. "You know," he mused, "my dad always used to say, People have very strong reactions to snakes. You'd think folks would be a little calmer, considering these guys are totally harmless. Harmless? Karen practically screeched. Jake, this is insane. What kind of psycho keeps snakes in a shed? Jake smirked. The kind who doesn't appreciate uninvited guests. Karen's breath hitched. She took one shaky step backward. You planned this, didn't you? Jake simply raised an eyebrow. Karen's eye twitched. You absolute lunatic. By now, the shed had devolved into full-blown pandemonium. Drunken partygoers were pushing and shoving to get out the door, shrieking like they were being chased by a pack of wolves. A guy in a baseball cap nearly tripped over himself, trying to vault over a table. Karen, seeing her minions abandon ship, turned to Jake one last time with a furious glare. You're insane, she hissed. This is so not over, Jake. He gave her a mock sympathetic look. Guess you'll have to throw your next party somewhere else, huh? Karen let out a frustrated growl before storming out the door, her high heels clicking against the concrete. Jake sighed, watching as the last of the uninvited guests fled into the night. With the shed finally quiet, he turned to Jasper, who had stopped moving and was now lazily blinking up at him. Good work, buddy, Jake murmured, reaching out to gently lift the snake back into its crate. Jasper gave a slow flick of his tongue in response. Jake smirked. Maybe his dad had been right. Snakes did have a way of weeding out the unwanted. The shed was in chaos. Drunken partygoers stumbled over each other, knocking over makeshift tables and tripping on discarded beer cans. The two pythons Jake had let loose weren't doing much, just lazily slithering across the wooden floor. But to the untrained eye, they might as well have been giant man-eating serpents. Jake stood calmly in the middle of it all, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. You all need to leave. Now. His voice was low, firm, and utterly serious. Karen, however, was still clinging to her arrogance like a lifeline. She stood near the center of the shed, her high heels planted defiantly, though Jake could see the slight tremor in her hands. She scoffed, rolling her eyes as if this was just another inconvenience she could brush off. Or what? She sneered. You'll call the HOA? Jake smirked. No, Karen. I'll give you 5 seconds to listen, or you'll find out why this shed really isn't a great place for a party. Karen narrowed her eyes, her lips twisting in a mocking grin. Oh, please, Jake. This is so pathetic. You think I'm scared of a couple of overgrown worms? Behind her, another guest let out a sharp yelp as Jasper, the albino python, slithered past his foot. The guy jumped onto a nearby crate, clutching his beer like it was a life raft. Karen let out a humorless laugh. I swear, you're such a drama queen. You act like this is some horror movie. She turned to address the partygoers, throwing her arms out dramatically. People, let's relax. They're just snakes. Harmless little noodles. What's the worst they can do? Slither around a little. Jake tilted his head, amusement flickering in his eyes. These snakes, he shrugged. Yeah, they're harmless. But, the ones in that crate. He nodded toward a particularly large, reinforced wooden box near the back wall. I wouldn't call those harmless. The air changed. Karen's smirk faltered for the first time. Jake didn't blink, didn't move. Just let the weight of his words settle over the room. Well, what do you mean? She asked, her voice suddenly a fraction softer. Jake exhaled slowly, dragging out the moment. My dad's collection? It wasn't just pythons and boas. He took a single step forward. He had a few other, let's say, less friendly species. A hushed murmur rippled through the remaining guests. Karen forced out another laugh, but it was weaker this time. Oh, give me a break, Jake. You're trying way too hard to scare us. Jake sighed. All right, guess I'll just show you. He walked toward the reinforced crate and placed his hand on the latch. That was all it took. Oh, hell no! A guy near the door practically launched himself outside, shoving past his friends. Wait, wait, wait! Another girl shrieked, backing away. Are you serious? What's in there? Jake didn't answer. He just lifted the latch a fraction of an inch. The response was instant. A sharp, distinct hissing noise emerged from inside the crate. Karen went pale. The shed erupted into panic. People scrambled for the door, pushing and shoving in a mad rush to escape. Drinks were abandoned, chairs knocked over, and someone actually dived through the open window rather than wait for the bottleneck at the entrance. Karen was still frozen in place, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "You're bluffing," she stammered. Jake gave her a slow, deliberate look. "Try me." Karen's lips parted as if she wanted to argue, but no words came out. Her hands clenched at her sides, her carefully crafted persona cracking. Another hiss came from the crate, louder this time. That did it. Karen bolted. She spun on her heel, yanking up her designer skirt as she sprinted toward the exit. She shoved past the last few stragglers, practically knocking over one of her own friends in her desperation to escape. Jake watched with quiet satisfaction as she disappeared into the night. The shed was empty now. The only sounds left were the occasional clink of a rolling beer can, the distant chatter of fleeing partygoers, and the slow, rhythmic breathing of the pythons still curled up near the crates. Jake let out a long breath, shaking his head. Then he reached down, relatching the crate. There was nothing inside. The hissing. Just an old trick his dad had taught him, a tiny compressed air valve hidden at the bottom of the box. One quick turn of the knob, and it let out a sharp, snake-like hiss. Jake chuckled to himself. Works every time. He turned back to Jasper, who had returned to his lazy slither near the corner of the shed. Guess we won't be having any more surprise parties, huh, buddy? Jasper flicked his tongue in response. Jake grabbed an old broom and started sweeping up the mess. It would take a little effort to get things back to normal, but it was worth it. Because if there was one thing he was sure of, Karen wouldn't be back. Laughter rippled through the drunken crowd. Karen stood with her arms crossed, smirking as if Jake was nothing more than an annoying inconvenience. Oh, come on, Jake. Stop with the theatrics. Someone in the back chuckled. Yeah, what's he gonna do? Bite us? More laughter. A few people clinked their beer bottles together in mock celebration. Jake didn't say a word. He just walked across the shed, his boots crunching against spilled chips and shattered glass. He moved with purpose, his expression calm, almost amused. Karen watched him, her smirk faltering slightly. What are you doing? Jake didn't answer. He stopped in front of an old wooden cabinet, one that had been sitting untouched in the corner of the shed for years. With a casual flick of his wrist, he unlatched the rusted lock and pulled open the heavy doors. Inside, nestled between dusty jars and coiled ropes, sat a massive glass tank. Karen frowned. What is... Jake lifted the lid. A ripple of movement, a slow, deliberate slither. Then, a massive 12-foot python uncoiled itself from the tank, its thick, muscular body gliding over the edge and down Jake's arm. The room went dead silent. The snake's pale golden scales gleamed under the dim party lights. Its thick body curled lazily around Jake's shoulders, its tongue flicking out to taste the air. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, someone let out a strangled gasp. Oh, my God. Jake finally broke the silence. He scratched the back of his neck, shifting the python's weight slightly. This here's Luna, he said, his voice casual, like he was introducing a family pet. She's real friendly, unless she feels threatened. A beer can clattered to the floor. The first wave of fear set in. Someone in the back muttered, Nope, 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 before bolting for the door. Another guy, clearly trying to act tough, forced a laugh. Oh, please, it's just a... Luna's head turned toward him. He screamed. That was it. Panic erupted. A girl shrieked and jumped onto a table. A guy tripped over his own feet trying to back away. Someone in the corner swore loudly, grabbing their drunk friend by the collar and dragging them toward the exit. Karen was frozen in place, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. You're insane, she whispered. Jake just shrugged, adjusting Luna on his shoulders. Nah, just a guy who doesn't like trespassers. Karen finally snapped out of it. She let out a horrified noise and bolted, shoving past her own guests in her rush to escape. One by one, the partygoers vanished into the night, their drunken excitement replaced by raw terror. Jake smirked. Now that was how you clear a party. The moment Karen's eyes locked onto the massive snake draped across Jake's shoulders, her face twisted in sheer horror. Her mouth opened, but for a brief second no sound came out, just a silent, gaping scream, as if her brain refused to process what she was seeing. Then she let loose. A blood-curdling, ear-piercing shriek ripped through the shed, loud enough to make Jake flinch. It was the kind of scream that sent shivers down spines, the kind that triggered a primal reaction in everyone around her. For a moment, there was an eerie pause. Then, pure, unfiltered, pandemonium. Someone gasped so hard they choked. A beer bottle slipped from a guy's hand and shattered against the floor. Then, as if a switch had flipped, the entire party erupted into chaos. "Oh my God!" a girl screeched, scrambling backwards so fast that she tripped over a pile of camping chairs. A guy in a Hawaiian shirt grabbed his girlfriend and tried to throw her in front of him, using her as a human shield. She smacked him so hard his sunglasses went flying. Someone else, already way too drunk, stumbled into a table, sending a full bowl of chips soaring through the air like confetti. Another dude in flip-flops screamed, jumped onto a chair, then lost his balance and went crashing into a speaker. The music cut out with a pathetic tsk, plunging the shed into eerie, panicked silence. Jake sighed, adjusting Luna on his shoulders. "See," he said casually, though his voice barely carried over the hysteria. "This is why I told you all to leave." Karen, meanwhile, had completely lost it. Her face had gone pale, her eyes darting frantically between Jake and the enormous python that was now slithering lazily around his arm. That thing," she stammered, pointing a trembling finger at Luna like she was trying to summon some invisible authority to make it disappear. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Her name's Luna." Karen didn't care. She was already backing up, her heels clicking against the shed floor as she tried to put as much distance as possible between herself and the snake. "You're crazy! You brought a monster in here!" Jake smirked. "Actually, she lives here." Karen's jaw dropped, but before she could respond, a guy in the crowd sprinted past her, shoving people out of the way. "Nope, nope, nope, nope," he chanted, tripping over an abandoned cooler as he made a beeline for the exit. His panic was contagious. The moment he bolted, others followed. A girl shrieked as she vaulted over a folding chair, knocking over a tray of drinks. Someone else slammed into a wall trying to escape, but barely noticed, too busy flailing like they were being chased by a horror movie villain. Another dude, clearly trying to be a hero, grabbed a mop from the corner and brandished it like a weapon. "Stay back!" he shouted at Luna. Jake gave him a look. "Dude, she's a snake. She doesn't speak English." But the warning didn't matter. Someone else had already knocked over a stack of crates, sending them tumbling into a pile of cheap party decorations. Panic everywhere. Karen finally snapped out of her frozen horror and whipped around, shoving past a couple who were still trying to process what was happening. Move! She screeched, clawing her way toward the door. But in her blind panic, she miscalculated. Her foot slipped on a puddle of spilled beer, and with a dramatic flail, she went down. Hard. She landed flat on her back, her expensive dress now soaked in alcohol and dirt. Jake watched as she scrambled to get up, hands slipping against the mess on the floor. For a second, he almost felt bad. Almost. Then he saw the look on her face. Utter humiliation, rage, and most importantly, fear. And he decided that maybe this was exactly what she deserved. "Hope you enjoyed the party, Karen," he called out. Karen shot him a look filled with pure hatred, but she was too busy escaping to respond. As more guests fled, tripping over each other in their desperation to get out, Jake simply stood there, calm and collected, watching them all go. In less than a minute, the shed went from a wild, alcohol-fueled bash to a scene of absolute disaster. Trash littered the floor. The smell of spilled drinks and panic sweat lingered in the air, and the only sounds left were a few distant screams from people still running. Karen was the last one to reach the door, panting, her hair in complete disarray. She turned back one final time, pointing a shaking finger at Jake. You'll pay for this." Jake just smiled. "Nah, but you will." And with that, he turned back toward Luna, gently stroking the python's back as she curled around his arm. Behind him, the shed door slammed shut as Karen and her uninvited guest disappeared into the night. Karen bolted for the door, her heels clicking wildly against the floor, her expensive dress smeared with dirt and spilled drinks. She was almost there, almost free, when disaster struck. Her foot caught on something, a discarded purse. With a strangled yelp, she tripped forward, flailing like a windmill before crashing onto the floor with an undignified thud. "Oh, come on!" she shrieked, trying to scramble up. But fate wasn't done with her yet. A sudden rustling noise filled the air. The shed, which had once been filled with drunken cheers and thumping music, now carried a much different sound. A slithering, shifting sound. Karen froze. Slowly, so slowly, she turned her head. From the dark corners of the shed, from beneath old crates and behind forgotten storage bins, something moved. Not just one, not just two, many. Thick, muscular bodies slid into the dim light. Scales gleamed as the creatures emerged, drawn by the vibrations of the chaos around them. More snakes. A guest near the wall turned just in time to see a massive boa constrictor lazily unfurling from a pile of old tarps. His eyes widened to the size of dinner plates. "Nope!" he screamed, and did the first thing that came to mind. He vaulted straight through a window. Crash! Glass shattered as he dove headfirst into the night, landing somewhere outside with a groan. That was all it took to tip the party from panic into absolute hysteria. A girl nearby let out a scream so high-pitched it could break glass. "I'm gonna die! I'm gonna die!" she wailed, sprinting in circles before finally making it out the door. Another guy tripped over a cooler, flopped onto his back, and immediately started crab-walking backward when he saw a python lazily slithering across the floor. Meanwhile, Karen was losing her mind. She scrambled to her knees, her hands shaking as she tried to stand, but she couldn't take her eyes off the massive, sinuous bodies moving around her. One of the snakes, a thick, dark brown boa, slid across the floor, pausing just inches from her hand. Its tongue flicked out. Karen lost it. "Oh my God, it's a nightmare!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Who keeps snakes in a shed?" Jake, still leaning against the wall, arms crossed, grinned. Me." Karen let out another choked sound, somewhere between a sob and an enraged scream, and finally sprinted out the door, shoving aside anyone in her way. As she disappeared into the night, Her once glamorous appearance reduced to a wild, sweaty mess, Jake exhaled and looked around at the wreckage of his shed. Empty, quiet, just him, the snakes, and a very satisfying sense of victory. Jake chuckled to himself. Best party ever. The last of the drunken partiers disappeared into the night, their terrified screams fading into the distance. Jake stood at the doorway of his shed, watching the chaos unfold like the grand finale of a horror movie. Discarded red Solo cups, half-eaten snacks, and a few abandoned jackets littered the ground. A car engine roared to life, its tires kicking up gravel as a group of panicked guests peeled out of his driveway like they were escaping the apocalypse. And then there was Karen. She stood a few feet away, her once perfect dress stained with dirt. Twigs tangled in her disheveled blonde hair. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, her face twisted in a mixture of humiliation and rage. Jake casually leaned against the shed's doorframe, arms crossed, watching her with pure amusement. Karen finally turned to him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You knew about this, didn't you?" she spat, her voice hoarse from all the screaming. Jake smirked. "Knew about what?" "The snakes!" she screeched, gesturing wildly at the shed. "You knew they were in there the whole time." Jake shrugged. "It's my property, Karen. I know everything that's in my shed. Maybe next time, ask before you break in." Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. "You set me up," she accused. "You let me throw a party in there, knowing it was full of my pet snakes," Jake finished for her, raising an eyebrow. "That's funny, Karen, because I don't remember inviting you or your guests here." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but immediately snapped it shut. She had no excuse, no witty retort. For the first time ever, Karen had nothing to say. A few of the remaining stragglers stood off to the side, staring at her in awkward silence. They weren't just humiliated. They were angry. They had trusted her.